I broke a rule. One rule out of 6. And I told myself it didn't matter because the voice was real. It sounded real. It knew the exact words, the exact pause, the exact way he used to say, my name, not Daniel. Never Daniel, just Danny, soft on the second syllable, like he was afraid I'd hang up. I didn't hang up. That was the problem 8 years ago, and it was the problem again on the last night. And now someone is gone because I couldn't do the one thing every rule on that laminated sheet demanded. Nothing. I'm recording this in the station. It's 4:47 a.m. The generator's running, but the radio's been off since midnight. I don't trust the radio anymore. I don't trust the quiet either, because the quiet here has texture. It leans against the windows. It presses on the roof. And sometimes it breathes. If you're hearing this, you're probably the next hire. They'll tell you the turnover is seasonal. They'll tell you the district is understaffed because of budget cuts. They'll tell you the pay is good for overnight work. And they'll be right about that part, because hazard pay has a way of looking generous when no one asks what the hazard is. My name is Daniel Voss. The people who matter call me Danny. The woods call me Danny too. That's the part I need you to understand before anything else. I spent 8 years answering 911 calls on the overnight shift in Harlan County. 8 years of voices, panicked, drunk, bleeding, lying, dying. You learn to read distance in a voice. You learn the difference between someone who's scared and someone who's hurt, between a whisper that means hiding and a whisper that means shock. You learn that silence on a live line is the worst sound in the world, because silence means you're too late, and the connection is all that's left. I was good at the job. That's not pride. It's context. I was good at the job the way a dog is good at hearing a whistle. It's not a skill. It's a wound shaped like a skill. Every voice that came through that headset landed somewhere in my chest and stayed. The last one stayed the longest. A teenage hiker. Lost off trail in the Cumberlands, hypothermic, fading, phone battery at 11%. I kept him talking for 42 minutes. I told him rescuers were close. I told him to keep his hands in his jacket. I told him I wouldn't leave the line. His name was Marcus. And in the last 30 seconds, his voice changed. Not weaker, just further, like he was being pulled back from the phone by something patient. And he said, "Danny, I think someone's here." And the line went to static. They never found him. Not a boot, not a jacket, not a bone. I left dispatch 4 months later. I wanted a job where no voice on a line could die while I sat in a chair doing nothing. A single ranger night patrol in an understaffed Appalachian district sounded like penance, sounded like silence. I got one of those things, and it wasn't the one I wanted. The posting was on a federal jobs board, buried 3 pages deep in seasonal park service listings. Night Patrol Ranger, Hollow Creek District, GS5 with locality adjustment, single coverage overnight rotation, no partner, no day overlap. Report to Station 9 at the district's southern trailhead, and complete patrol routes between sundown and sunrise. 5 nights on, 2 off. The pay was almost double what similar postings offered. I noticed that. I told myself it was a cost of living adjustment, that remote meant expensive, that the government was simply bad at competitive compensation and occasionally overshot. The interview was a phone call that lasted 9 minutes. The recruiter asked me 3 questions. 2 were about my emergency services background. The third was whether I had family in the region. I said no. I said I didn't have family in much of anywhere. She went quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet I recognized from dispatch, the quiet of someone writing something down that they don't want you to hear them write. "You'll do fine," she said, and her voice had the particular brightness of someone solving a problem they didn't want to explain. I drove in on a Tuesday in October. The directions took me off the state highway onto a county road, then a Forest Service road, then a gravel track that my GPS abandoned after the second switchback. The last 8 miles had no cell service, no passing pull-offs, and no signs except faded brown posts marking mileage to a trailhead I couldn't see through the trees. The mountains closed around the road like hands cupping water. The first thing I noticed about the hollow wasn't the fog, though the fog was there low and slow, threading through the hardwoods like something poured. It wasn't the station, though Station 9 was handsome in the way old backcountry buildings sometimes are. Native stone foundation, squared timber walls darkened by decades of wood smoke, a green metal roof gone to moss. It wasn't the trailhead, or the empty parking area, or the register box standing alone under a post like a small grave marker. It was the sound, or the absence of it. I shut the truck door, and the noise died within arm's reach. Not faded, died. The mountains around the valley were steep and close, old-growth canopy, locking overhead like a cathedral ceiling. And the acoustics were something I'd never encountered. A creek ran 40 yards south of the station, and I could hear it clearly, each separate note of water over stone, but it sounded like it was running inside my head rather than across the ground. A crow called from somewhere on the ridge, and the sound arrived at my shoulder, intimate, as if the bird were perched on my collarbone. The station was unlocked. Inside it smelled like pine resin, old paper, and the mineral tang of a wood stove that had been burning for decades without a full cleaning. The main room held a desk, a radio unit, a wall of topo maps flagged with colored pins, and a cot behind a half partition. The generator hummed in a lean-to out back, and the refrigerator clicked on while I stood there, startling me more than I'd admit. It was beautiful. Not in a postcard way, in a weight-on-the-chest way. The kind of beauty that's inseparable from loneliness, where the landscape is so large and so indifferent that your presence feels like an error the mountains haven't noticed yet. I set my bag on the cot. The radio hissed with dead air. The wood stove ticked as the metal cooled. From the window, the fog filled the valley floor in a single pale sheet, and nothing moved in it, and nothing sounded from it. And I told myself that the silence was the whole reason I'd come. Then the outgoing ranger knocked, and he was holding a laminated page, like a man holding a leash for a dog he didn't want to describe. His name badge said Perry, but he never introduced himself. He was mid-50s, wire-thin, and had the careful movements of someone who'd trained himself not to make noise, not quiet the way introverts are quiet, but quiet the way prey animals are quiet, each step placed, each gesture controlled. He didn't sit down. He stood inside the door, with one hand still on the frame, as if reserving the option of leaving quickly, and held out the laminated sheet. "These are the night rules," he said, "district-specific. They won't be in your orientation packet, and they're not in the federal manual. They stay in this station." I took the page. It was heavy-gauge laminate, the kind you'd use for a menu, expected to survive grease and years. The text was printed in clean, black, serif font, official enough to look like policy, strange enough to feel like scripture. The edges were soft from handling, multiple hands, over time. I read the first line and almost smiled. 1. If you hear your name from the tree line, do not turn your headlamp toward it. Log the time. Keep walking. "Is this a hazing thing?" I asked. Perry didn't blink. "Read the rest." I read the rest. 6 rules. All about voices. All with the calm, specific language of someone who had measured the danger to the syllable and written instructions not to persuade, but to keep someone alive long enough to follow them. Perry watched me read. When I finished, he spoke one more time. "Log everything," he said, "especially what you ignore." He was in his truck and pulling out of the gravel lot before I could ask what that meant. His taillights disappeared into the fog, and the sound of his engine died at the tree line, like every other sound in this valley, not fading, just stopping, as though the hollow had placed a hand over its mouth. I looked at the sheet again. 6 rules. Official font. Laminated for permanence. I hung it on the nail by the door where it clearly belonged, judging by the shadow the old nail had worn into the wood. And I told myself it was local color, the kind of superstition every old station accumulates, passed down, ranger to ranger, like a ghost story dressed in procedure. I sat at the desk that night, with a laminated page flat under the lamp, a cup of black coffee cooling beside it. And I did what any former dispatcher would do with an unfamiliar protocol. I picked it apart. Rule 1. Don't turn your headlamp toward a voice calling your name. Fine. Appalachian hollows distort sound. A hiker calling from a ridge could sound like they're at your elbow. Turning a light toward a false source in rough terrain is how people trip, fall, and become their own search and rescue case. The log the time part was standard incident reporting language. I could rationalize it. Rule 2. Voices calling for help after 2:14 a.m. are never people. The timestamp was the problem. Not after 2 a.m., not in the early hours. 2:14, exactly. Hypothermia hallucinations and nighttime disorientation could explain phantom voices. And telling a solo ranger not to launch into the backcountry alone at 3 in the morning was basic safety. But nobody writes 2:14 unless 2:14 means something specific. Bureaucracy's round. This number had not been rounded. Someone chose it because they had to. Rule 3. A voice that repeats a phrase twice is still learning. On the 3rd repetition, it is finished. Break radio silence only on the 3rd. I stared at this one the longest. The language wasn't about echoes or acoustics. It was about process, learning. The word learning implied something with intent, something acquiring skill, and the instruction wasn't to run. It was to wait, to let the first 2 repetitions pass, and to call for help only when the thing had completed its work. That meant the 3rd repetition was a threshold. For what? Rule 4. Never confirm you're alone. Scripted answer. My partner's right behind me. A lie, engineered and sanctioned. The district had one ranger on overnight. Everyone involved in writing this rule knew it was a lie. They wrote it anyway, which meant honesty was more dangerous than dishonesty, and that whatever asked the question could be satisfied by words alone, as if language itself were the mechanism. Rule 5. Return by the same trail. If markers have changed color or count, sit and wait for correction. Trail markers are bolted to trees. They don't change. They don't multiply. The rule assumed a reality where fixed objects moved, and the recommended response was not to flee, but to remain still and trust that the world would reassemble itself. This was not a rule written by someone who didn't believe what they were writing. Rule 6. If you hear a voice you know to be dead, do not weep, do not speak, do not stop. Grief is the door. I read that one 3 times. No rationalization fit. No acoustic illusion explanation. No hypothermia caveat. The rule assumed you would hear someone dead. It assumed the dead voice would be specific enough to grieve. And it told you that the grief itself was the danger, not the voice, not the source, but your own emotional response. Someone had written these rules from inside the experience. Every line carried the weight of a specific night, a specific mistake. Folklore isn't this careful. Policy isn't this desperate. These rules sat in the space between, and the precision of them, the 214. The third repetition, the scripted lie, told me more than Perry's silence ever could. Someone had counted. Someone had watched. Someone had survived just long enough to write it down. I pinned the page back on the nail and turned off the lamp. In the dark, the station settled around me, and through the window, the fog lay across the valley without moving. I told myself I didn't believe any of it, but I set my watch alarm for 2 a.m., 14 minutes early, and I couldn't explain why, except that the number 214 had lodged in my head like a frequency I couldn't untune. My first patrol was late afternoon, 3 hours before sundown, and the district had given me a route card marked in blue ink by a hand I assumed was Perry's. Station 9 to mile marker 4, along the Ridgeline Trail, south to the Hemlock Spur Junction. Return by the same path. 6 miles, mostly level, with a trailhead register check at each end and a radio check-in at the turnaround. The forest was gorgeous. October had turned the canopy to rust and gold, and the light came through in long amber columns that made the trail look like the aisle of something old and deliberate. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold stone and the faint sweetness of decay that healthy forests carry without apology. My boots found a rhythm on the packed earth, and for the first time in months, the tightness in my chest loosened by a half-turn, as though my lungs had been given permission to expand fully. I checked the register at the Ridgeline trailhead. 2 parties logged, a couple doing an out-and-back day hike, and a solo backpacker headed for the ridgetop shelter. I noted their times, their intended routes, their vehicle descriptions. The familiar bureaucracy of it settled me. This was work I understood: names, times, plans, accountability. The clipboard in my hand felt like a handshake with competence. I counted trail markers on the way out. 9 between Station 9 and the Hemlock Junction, each one a brown fiberglass post with a yellow blaze at eye height. I logged the count in my field book because the rules told me to care about markers. And even if I didn't believe the rules yet, counting was free. At the turnaround, I radioed in. The signal was clean, the dispatcher's voice flat and professional. Station 9, copy your position, Hemlock Spur Junction, all clear. I confirmed. The exchange lasted 8 seconds. Nobody's voice caught in their throat. Nobody was lost. Walking back, I fixed a leaning sign at mile 3 and cleared a downed branch from the trail. Small, competent tasks. Ranger work. I'd wanted this simplicity, and here it was. By the time I reached the station, the light was bronze, and the valley was filling with its first tendrils of evening fog. I ate a sandwich at the desk, logged my patrol, and felt something I hadn't felt since the night Marcus's line went dead. The quiet satisfaction of a shift where nothing went wrong. I should have been suspicious of that feeling. In this valley, normalcy is bait. Night patrol began at 10. The route was the same ridgeline trail to Hemlock Spur and back, but the forest had changed its terms. The headlamp cut a tunnel through the dark, and everything beyond the beam was the kind of black that has weight. The canopy blocked the stars. The fog had thickened into something I walked through rather than beside, and it carried sound in ways that made my dispatcher's ear twitch. Every noise arriving without direction, without distance, suspended in the damp air like a word held between teeth. I heard talking at mile 1, conversation, low and steady, the cadence of 2 people walking together. I stopped and listened. The register had been clear since 4 p.m. The day hikers were long gone. The solo backpacker was at the ridgetop shelter 3 miles above. There should be no one on this section of trail after dark. I logged it. Time, location, description, 2 voices, conversational tone, no visual contact, estimated distance 100 yards east. Standard. Probably off-register campers. The district was too big and too understaffed for complete compliance. People slipped through. I kept walking. At mile 2, a child laughed. Not a recording, not an echo. A child's laugh, clear and bright and close. The kind of sound that belongs to mid-afternoon in a suburban yard, not to a fog-bound Appalachian trail at 11:20 p.m. There were no children on the register. There were no children within miles. I stopped. The laugh stopped. I walked. The laugh resumed. I stopped. It stopped. 3 more times I tested it, and 3 more times the pattern held. My footsteps and the laughter moved in perfect synchronization, not approaching, not receding, maintaining an exact interval like a shadow that had learned to use sound instead of light. When I walked, it walked with me. When I paused, it paused. An echo wouldn't match my pace. A real child couldn't maintain that precision in the dark. And no animal I knew of in these mountains could produce that sound. Not a fox's scream. Not a bobcat. Not the strange warbling of a barred owl. I logged it. I kept walking. The laugh followed me for a quarter mile, then stopped between one step and the next, as if it had reached a boundary I couldn't see, and simply ended. The rest of the patrol was silent. Not peaceful silent. Waiting silent. The fog pressed close. My headlamp showed me 20 feet of trail and nothing else, and the nothing else was so complete that the forest beyond the beam might as well have not existed. I was 200 yards from the station when I heard it. My name. Danny. From the tree line, right side, close enough to touch if I'd extended my arm. Not shouted, not whispered. Spoken, the way someone speaks to a person they know well, with an intimacy that assumes you'll turn, because of course you'll turn when someone says your name like that. Nobody here knew that name. My paperwork said Daniel. My badge said VOSS. Danny was for people I'd let in, and I hadn't let anyone in since the night a boy's voice disappeared mid-syllable on a 911 line. My hand went to the headlamp. Pure reflex. Find the voice. Identify the caller. Respond. 8 years of training compressed into a single motion. Rule 1 hit me like a wall. If you hear your name from the tree line, do not turn your headlamp toward it. My fingers stopped on the lamp housing. My heart was hitting my ribs hard enough that I could feel it in my wrists. Every professional instinct I had screamed at me to turn, to look, to answer, because that's what you do when someone calls your name in the dark. That's what you do when a voice needs you. I didn't turn. I logged the time, 12:07 a.m., with a hand that shook badly enough to make the pen skip. I kept walking. Behind me, the voice said nothing more, but the silence it left behind had a different quality than the silence before it. Heavier, more specific, as if the air itself had recorded what just happened and was holding it for reference. I made it back to the station and locked the door and sat at the desk with both hands flat on the wood until they stopped trembling. The coffee was cold. The radio hissed. The laminated rules hung on their nail by the door, and I stared at Rule 1 like it owed me an explanation. If you hear your name from the tree line, do not turn your headlamp toward it. Log the time. Keep walking. I'd followed it. Mostly. My hand had gone to the lamp, but I hadn't turned the beam. The distinction felt important, though I couldn't have told you why, except that the rule's language was specific. Do not turn your headlamp toward it. And specificity, in my experience, was how people who'd survived something once tried to save the next person from it. The voice had known my name, not my rank, not my title, not the surname on my badge. Danny, the private version. The version that lived in the mouths of people I'd trusted, and in the mouth of one boy who'd used it as an anchor while hypothermia pulled him under. I went through the rational options. Someone in the district office had used my first name in a memo. A local had overheard it. Sound carried wrong in this valley, and I'd misidentified a word. Any of these could be true. None of them explained the intimacy of the tone, the unhurried certainty with which the voice had spoken, as if it already knew I'd hear it, as if calling my name weren't a question, but a confirmation. I didn't sleep. I sat in the amber cone of the desk lamp and reread the rules and listened to the station settle around me. And sometime before dawn, I opened my field book and saw the entry I'd written at 12:07. The shaky letters, the logged time, the location, and beneath it, in handwriting that was mine, but that I did not remember producing. A single sentence. It knows I'm listening. I stared at those words until the first gray light touched the window. I hadn't written them. I had no memory of writing them. But the pen was in my hand, and the ink was fresh, and the handwriting was unmistakably mine, down to the way I cross my T's with a leftward slant that no one else would replicate by chance. The rules were not folklore. The rules were not hazing. The rules were a record of something that was happening to me right now. And I'd carried a laminated copy on my body like a talisman, without understanding that talismans only matter when the thing they ward against is real. I need to be honest about what happened the next night, because this is the part where I stopped doubting and started counting the hours until dawn, like a man counting the rungs of a ladder above a flood. Same route, same fog. Mile 3, approximately 11:40 p.m. The voice came again. Danny. Same tree line, same side, same tone, that terrible, patient intimacy, like a friend leaning close in a quiet room. I kept my eyes forward. I kept walking. I logged the time. My hand didn't go to the headlamp this time, because I'd spent the entire day rehearsing the rule until it lived in my muscles instead of my thoughts. But then it said it again. Danny, turn around. And my hand moved. Not to the headlamp, to the beam switch on my chest rig, the secondary light I'd clipped there for map reading. I flicked it toward the tree line for less than a second. Half a second. A reflex so fast I'd already killed the beam before my conscious mind registered the decision. The light touched the trees. There was nothing there. No shape, no eyes, no figure, just fog and bark and the black spaces between trunks. But the voice stopped instantly. Not faded. Stopped. The way a recording stops when someone hits pause mid-breath, mid-formation, as if the sound had been a line cast out and the light had set the hook. And from the dark where the beam had touched, something exhaled. I've listened to people breathe for 8 years. Panicked breathing, injured breathing, the breathing of people hiding under furniture while someone broke through their front door. I know every variation of human breath. This was not human breath. It was the sound of breath, the acoustic shape of it, the rise and fall, produced by something that understood the mechanics, but not the need. An exhale without lungs, a sigh of satisfaction from a thing that didn't require air. I ran, not walked, not proceeded at a brisk pace, the way I'd write it in a log. I ran the remaining mile and a half to the station, with the headlamp bouncing and my pack slamming my kidneys and the fog splitting around me like water around a hull. I locked the door. I checked the windows. I sat in the center of the room with every light on, breathing hard, hands on my knees. The radio was full of static. Not normal static, patterned static, rhythmic, rising and falling like breath. I turned it off. In the morning, I checked my log and found a new entry below the previous one, in my handwriting, at a time I had been running. 12:03 a.m. Contact confirmed. Attention acknowledged. Channel open. I hadn't written it. I hadn't stopped running long enough to open the book. I sat at the desk and looked at the laminated page and understood, in the way you understand a diagnosis you've been suspecting for weeks, that Rule 1 was not about sound or terrain or caution. The headlamp wasn't a tool. It was an answer. Turning light toward the voice was turning attention toward the voice, and attention, the focused, conscious act of acknowledging the call was what it wanted. The light was how you said yes. The light was how you opened the door. And I had opened it. Just a crack. Just for half a second. But in this valley, half a second was enough to let something know you were listening. 4 nights in, I'd settled into a pattern that resembled discipline, but was closer to controlled fear. Patrol at 10, radio check every 2 hours, eyes forward, headlamp aimed only at the trail, log everything, respond to nothing from the tree line. The rules lived on the desk, on the nail by the door, and in a folded copy in my breast pocket. Because redundancy is what dispatch training teaches you when a protocol is the only thing between you and a dead caller. It was a clear night. The fog had pulled back to the valley floor and left the ridgeline trail open under a half moon that turned the bare branches silver white. I was at mile 2, moving south, and for the first time since the chest rig incident, I felt something close to equilibrium. Not safety, equilibrium. The understanding that the rules were a framework and the framework held, and as long as I stayed inside it, I would walk back to Station 9 on my own legs. Then I heard the woman. She was screaming. Not the wild, open-mouthed screaming of panic, but the ragged, desperate screaming of someone who has been screaming for a long time and no longer has the breath for volume, a voice torn at the edges, breaking on every third word. "Help, please, someone. I'm hurt. Please, help me, I can't." Every circuit in my brain lit up at once. 8 years, thousands of calls. I knew this voice, not the identity, but the type. This was a real person in real distress. The cadence was right. The breathing was right. The way the words degraded under physical pain was right. I had heard this exact pattern from car accident victims, from fall injuries, from people trapped in structures. My hands were already moving radio to my mouth, feet pivoting toward the sound before the conscious part of my mind caught up. I checked my watch. 2:09 a.m. 5 minutes? 5 minutes until Rule 2's forbidden hour. The voice was coming from downslope, east, maybe 300 yards into the timber. I could reach her in 5 minutes. I could reach her before 2:14, and the rule wouldn't apply because I would have initiated the rescue before the cutoff. The rule said, don't initiate between 2:14 and first light. It didn't say anything about reaching someone you'd already started toward. My foot hit the downslope. I was 50 yards into the timber when I checked my watch again. 2:11. The screaming was closer now, coherent enough to make out fragments. A hiking accident, a fall, a broken leg. Please. She could see a light. My light. She was right here, just a little further. A dispatcher knows when a caller is tracking your position. This woman was tracking my headlamp. She was adjusting her calls to my movement, her volume rising when I paused and dropping to a weep when I advanced, as if she were managing my pace, pulling me at a speed she controlled. 2:13. I stopped. My boot was on a root, and my hand was on a birch trunk, and the screaming was close enough now that I could hear the wet hitch of breath between each cry, the precise physiological signature of someone whose diaphragm is compromised by pain. Every cell in me said, go. Rule 2 said stop. The second hand on my watch swept toward the 12. 2:14 a.m. The woman's voice changed. Not gradually. Not the way a real person's voice changes when they're fading or shifting position. It changed the way a channel changes a clean, instantaneous cut from one frequency to another. The same words, the same pitch, the same torn breathing. But now it was coming from 3 directions at once. East, where I'd been heading. Northwest, behind and above me. Due south, downhill toward the creek. 3 identical screams, synchronized to the syllable. The same wet gasp between each word, hitting at the same instant from 3 points that would have required 3 separate throats, 3 separate sets of lungs, 3 women in identical agony arranged in a triangle around my position in the dark. I stopped breathing. The screaming continued for 10 seconds, perfectly mirrored, and then all 3 voices stopped simultaneously and were replaced by my own voice. My own voice, playing back the radio check I'd made at midnight. Station 9, Ridgeline Patrol, all clear, no contact. Word for word, inflection for inflection. The slight catch on no contact where I'd hesitated, because if the logged entry about the child's laughter counted. It played the sentence once from the east, then once from the northwest, then once from the south. Each repetition was more accurate than the last. The first was close to recording, maybe, something captured from the radio frequency. The second was closer. The third was mine. Not like mine. Mine. My voice, with my breath, with my mouth shape and my chest resonance, and the way my vowels flatten when I'm tired. And hearing it come from the dark was like hearing my own eulogy, delivered by something that had already measured me for the box. I backed up the slope, slowly. Every step deliberate, every placement silent. My headlamp aimed straight up so the beam wouldn't touch the trees. The voices followed me at an even distance, neither closing nor receding. And the woman's screaming resumed between my replayed words, layered now. Help me, Station 9. Please, I'm hurt. All clear. No contact, a collage of real distress and stolen language, woven so tightly that the seams only showed if you knew what to listen for. I knew what to listen for. 8 years on the dispatch line had trained me to hear the human under the noise, and beneath all of it, the screaming, my own voice, the wet breathing, there was nothing human. There was patience, there was mechanics, there was the focused attention of something practicing. I reached the trail. I walked back to Station 9. I locked the door and turned off the radio and sat in the dark because I couldn't bear to hear static that might be breathing. In the logbook, I wrote 2:14. Rule 2 confirmed. Voice multiplied. My own radio transmission replayed. Did not initiate rescue. Probable hostile mimicry. My hands were steady when I wrote it. Dispatch training. You can fall apart after the log is complete. You can shake and sweat and press your palms against your eyes until the afterimages stop. But the log comes first, because the log is what survives you. I sat in the station and listened to the silence, and the silence was not empty. And I understood for the first time that if I had answered, if I had walked those last 100 yards toward the screaming woman, I would have walked into the center of a triangle of voices that were already learning to sound like me. And nobody would have come looking, 'cause who searches for a single ranger in a district that can't keep one? Dawn came slowly, the way it does in the deep hollows. Not a sunrise, but a gradual lightening, as if the sky were filling with milk. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the remaining hours of darkness reviewing every patrol I'd find in the station's desk drawers, looking for patterns, looking for someone else's confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. The desk logs were clean. Too clean. 6 months of entries in Perry's handwriting, all brief, all procedural, patrol complete, no contact, weather clear. Not a single mention of voices, anomalies, or rules. Either Perry had experienced nothing in 6 months of night patrol, or he'd been too disciplined or too afraid to document what he'd experienced. At first light, I walked to the trailhead to check the register, and there was a truck in the lot. It was old, a rust-bottomed Ford with a Park Service decal, so faded it was more ghost than emblem. The man leaning against the tailgate was in his 70s, wearing a canvas jacket and a ball cap with the district's old logo. A design I'd seen in photographs in the station, but not on any current issue gear. He was holding a thermos and studying the register box with the proprietary attention of someone who'd been checking it for decades. "You're the new one," he said. Not a question. Danny Voss. Earl Hatcher, retired, 31 years in this district. He looked at me the way doctors look at imaging results they've already diagnosed. "You look like you didn't sleep." "Quiet night," I said. No, it wasn't. He poured coffee from his thermos into the cap. "Quiet's not what this valley does, son. Quiet's what it pretends to do." He wouldn't step past the register box. I noticed that. He stood with his boots on the gravel of the lot and his back to his truck. And he did not set foot on the trailhead, as though the pavement were a border and the trail beyond it were another country where his passport had been revoked. "How far do you go?" I asked. "This far. 2nd mile's my line. I don't cross it." "Why?" He drank from the thermos cap and looked at the trees beyond the register with an expression I recognized from the worst nights on dispatch, the expression of someone who has seen the thing they are describing and knows that describing it will cost them something. Because past the 2nd mile, it can hear you well enough to learn your name. And once it knows your name, it starts shopping for your voice. We sat on his tailgate in the early light, and he spoke carefully, the way men of his generation speak about things they respect enough to fear. Not dramatic, not embellished, just precise. The rules had been assembled over 4 decades, he said. Each one written after a ranger died or disappeared while doing the thing the rule now forbade. Rule 1 came from a woman named Linda Pace, who turned her lamp toward a voice calling her name in 1987 and was found the next morning standing in the creek bed with her eyes open and no recognition of her own identity. She lived another 11 years in a state facility and never spoke again. Rule 2 was written after 2 consecutive rangers initiated rescue operations between 2 and 3 a.m. and were never found. The time, 2:14, was pulled from the district's oldest incident report, a logger's disappearance in 1953 that was the first recorded loss in the hollow. The man's watch had stopped at 2:14. Every watch recovered since had stopped at the same time. The hollow doesn't rush, Earl said. It's patient. It waits for the right person, and then it gives them a reason to break the rules. The reason always feels noble. It always sounds like someone who needs help. He told me the rules had saved more rangers than they'd lost, but the ratio wasn't comforting. 11 gone in 4 decades. 11 that he knew of. The district's institutional memory was short by design, high turnover, minimal overlap. Records kept in paper rather than digital systems that might be searched or aggregated. Nobody had ever assembled the full picture because nobody stayed long enough to see it. Except Earl. Earl had stayed. Earl had followed every rule for 31 years and walked away intact. And he'd spent the decade since checking the register every morning to see if the new hire's name was still appearing in the log. When it stops appearing, he said, I make a phone call, and they post the position again. I asked about Rule 6. He went quiet for a long time. Rule 6 is the one that takes the good ones, he said, the ones who came here carrying something heavy. It finds the wound and it puts a voice on it. Not a stranger's voice, the voice of the person you lost, the person you failed. And it doesn't just say words, it finishes the conversation you never got to finish. He looked at me with something that wasn't pity, but was adjacent to it. You came here because of someone, didn't you? I didn't answer. They all do, he said. It picked you for a reason. They always pick the ones with unfinished calls. He told me the old logbooks were in the station cellar, in a locked footlocker behind the water heater. Perry's key should open it. Read them, he said. Read all of them. And then decide if you're staying or running, because this place doesn't give you long to choose. He got in his truck and started the engine. And through the window, he said one more thing. If you hear me out there after dark, it's not me. I don't go past the 2nd mile. Not for anyone. Not anymore. He pulled out of the lot, and I stood at the register and watched his truck disappear up the gravel road, and the morning was bright, and the birds were singing, and the valley was beautiful in that heavy, indifferent way that made me feel like an error the mountains were just beginning to notice. The cellar was accessed through a hatch in the station's back room, beneath a braided rug that looked like it had been placed there specifically to discourage curiosity. The stairs were stone, steep, and cold, and the space below smelled like mineral damp and old paper and the faint iron tang of water that has sat against rock for a very long time. The footlocker was where Earl said it would be, Army surplus green, behind the water heater. Perry's key fit. Inside were logbooks, not the clean desk logs I'd found upstairs, but field books, the kind rangers carry in their breast pockets. Dozens of them, spanning decades, each one filled with the handwriting of a different person. I carried them upstairs and spread them on the desk and started reading. The pattern was invisible if you only read one. It was unmistakable if you read them all. Each ranger's log began the same way. Careful entries, clear handwriting, professional observations, weather, trail conditions, wildlife sightings, register checks. Normal, competent, the voice of someone doing a job they understood. Then, usually within the first 2 weeks, the entries changed. A logged sound, an unregistered voice, a name called from the tree line. The handwriting stayed controlled, but the content shifted. Professional observations replaced by incident documentation. weather notes replaced by timestamps and locations of auditory contact. The rules would appear in the margins, referenced by number, as if the ranger were checking their work against the protocol. And then the handwriting deteriorated. Not slowly. There would be a night, a specific night, always close to 2:14, where the letters lost their consistency, where the pen pressed harder, where sentences bent across the page as if written by a hand that was shaking, or a mind that was splitting its attention between the book and something in the room. And then the entries stopped, not with a closing statement, not with a final log. Mid-sentence, every single one, a thought begun and never finished, a word started and never completed, as if the hand had simply lifted and the person behind it had ceased to exist between one letter and the next. I counted 11. 11 rangers whose handwriting I could trace from competence to fear to silence. 11 field books that ended in the middle of a thought. The most recent was Perry's predecessor. The handwriting was small and neat, a woman's hand, and her last entry was dated 14 months before I arrived. November 3rd, contact at mile 3, 2:11 a.m. Voice identified as my husband, Robert. Repetition count, 2. Robert has been dead since June. I am not going to respond. I am going to wait for the third repetition and break radio silence per Rule 3. If the third comes, it has learned him completely. I am sitting at the desk. The radio is on. I am waiting for the sentence ended there. No period. No closing. The pen had trailed off the edge of the ruled line and left a faint scratch across the margin. The ghost of a hand that had been moved, or moved itself away from the page. I sat with that logbook open in front of me for a long time. The generator hummed. The wood stove ticked. Outside, the afternoon light was gold and the valley was calm. And nothing in the landscape suggested that 11 people had disappeared from this room, from this desk, from this exact chair. But they had. And the thing that took them had spoken to each one in a voice they recognized, and each one had lasted exactly as long as their discipline held. And no longer. I should have left. I want to be clear about that. I had a truck with a full tank and a road that led to cell service, and a world where voices belonged to the people who made them. I could have driven out that afternoon and never come back, and the district would have posted the position within a week, and someone else would have sat at this desk and counted markers and listened for their name in the dark. But I stayed, because leaving felt like hanging up the phone. That night, I patrolled with the field book's weight in my chest instead of my pocket. Every sound was louder. Every shadow was a shape that hadn't committed to being visible. The fog was back, dense and low, and I walked the ridgeline trail with my headlamp on the ground and my ears open and the rules cycling through my mind like a prayer I wasn't sure I believed in, but couldn't afford to stop reciting. At 1:48 a.m., mile 3, the voice of Earl Hatcher came from the tree line. Danny. Earl's voice, Earl's cadence, the particular gravel of a 70-year-old throat that has spent decades breathing mountain air. Danny, listen to me. You need to come off the trail. I stopped. My hand went to my logbook. Danny, listen to me. You need to come off the trail. The same words, exactly the same inflection, Same pause between me and you. Same slight emphasis on need. Not similar, identical. A repetition so precise that it could only be produced by something that had recorded the first instance and was playing it back without variation. Repetition 1. Repetition 2. Rule 3. 2 means it's still learning. 3 means it's finished. Break radio silence, only on the third. I stood on the trail with my pen in my hand and my radio on my hip, and I waited for the third repetition. The fog pressed close. My headlamp made a small circle on the ground, and I stared at it, and did not look up, and did not speak, and did not move. The third repetition did not come. 10 minutes. 20. The fog shifted and resettled, and the forest made its small, unconscious sounds. Branch creak, leaf settle, the distant mutter of the creek, but Earl's voice did not speak again. 2 repetitions. Still learning. Not yet finished. I went back to the station, and I logged it, and I slept for 2 hours with the desk lamp on and the radio off. At dawn, I drove to the trailhead. Earl's truck was not there. I checked the register. His handwriting, the sharp, backward-leaning script I'd seen when he signed the book the morning we met, did not appear. I drove up the gravel road to the county highway and pulled over where cell service flickered to life and called the district office and asked for Earl Hatcher's contact information. The woman on the phone was quiet for a moment. Earl Hatcher retired in 2014, she said. He checks the register sometimes. We don't have a current phone number. I drove back to the trailhead. The lot was empty. I walked to the register and opened it and flipped back through the pages, looking for Earl's entries. There were none. Not from this week. Not from this month. The only handwriting in the register for the past 30 days was mine. I stood in the lot with the book open and the morning light pouring through the canopy, and I thought about Earl's voice in the dark. Danny, listen to me. You need to come off the trail. And I thought about how the thing in the hollow learns by repetition. 2 times to practice, 3 times to perfect. And I thought about a 70-year-old man who said he never went past the 2nd mile. The hollow had spoken Earl's voice twice. If the 3rd came, it would have him completely. And if Earl's truck was gone, and Earl's name was gone from the register, and Earl didn't answer his radio, then either Earl had finally left the valley, or the 3rd repetition had already happened somewhere I hadn't been listening. The nights after Earl's disappearance were different. Not louder, the hollow didn't increase its volume. It increased its confidence. The voices had been testing before, casting from the tree line like fishermen working a new pool, patient, exploratory. Now they stood closer. Now they waited on the trail itself. Night 7, Mile 2, just past the hemlock stand where the canopy is thickest and the headlamp's reach shrinks to a gray circle the size of a dinner table. I was walking at patrol pace, steady, controlled, when a voice spoke from beside the trail. Not from the trees, not from the fog, but from the shoulder of the path, close enough that if it had been a person, I would have felt their breath. Are you by yourself out here, Ranger? Calm, reasonable, the tone of a fellow professional making conversation on a shared route. No menace, no distortion, just a straightforward question, delivered with the easy confidence of someone who already knew the answer and wanted to hear me confirm it. My mouth opened. The truth sat right there on my tongue, because I was alone. I had always been alone in this district. Single ranger rotation. No partner. No overlap. The district had designed the position for solitude, and I had accepted it because solitude was what I thought I wanted. And now, the truth of that solitude was the most dangerous thing I could say. Rule 4. Never confirm you are alone. The only sanctioned answer is, my partner's right behind me. My partner's right behind me, I said. The words felt absurd leaving my mouth, a lie so transparent that any human would have laughed. I was standing on a dark trail in a depopulated valley at 1 a.m. and telling the empty air that I had company. The forest went silent. Not gradually, instantly. The creek stopped. The branch creek stopped. The small settling sounds of nighttime woods, all of it, cut off, as if someone had pressed mute on the entire valley. And in that silence, I felt something recalculate. There is no other word for it. The air around me shifted in quality, the way a room shifts when someone who is leaning forward sits back, reassessing, dissatisfied. The silence held for 30 seconds. Then the creek returned. Then the branches. Then the small, ordinary sounds of the forest reassembled themselves around me, piece by piece. And the presence that had been standing at my shoulder was gone, not departed, but withdrawn, the way a hand withdraws from a door it is found locked. I walked back to the station on legs I couldn't feel. And I understood Rule 4 the way I now understood all the rules, not as superstition, not as precaution, but as a structural truth about the thing that lived in this valley. It could only take the isolated. A believed second presence, even a lie, even a fiction, spoken aloud to nothing, made the harvest incomplete. The rules weren't psychology. They were engineering. Someone had reverse engineered the conditions under which the hollow could act. And the rules were the tolerances. Stay within them, and the machine couldn't close its jaws. But the tolerances were narrow, and getting narrower. Same night, the return. I was walking back to Station 9 by the same trail, same road out, same route back, per Rule 5, counting markers the way I'd counted them every night since the first patrol. 9 markers between the station and the Hemlock Junction. I'd verified the count in daylight. I'd logged it. I'd memorized the position of each post. At mile 1, I counted the 10th marker. I stopped, counted back. 10. There should be 9. I walked forward. 11. 12. The markers were multiplying. They stood in the fog like sentinels, each one identical brown fiberglass, yellow blaze at eye height. But now there were too many, and the blazes were wrong. Not yellow, orange. A deep arterial orange that didn't exist in any Park Service inventory I'd ever seen, glowing faintly in the headlamp's beam, as if the paint were generating its own light. Rule 5. If the trail markers have changed color or count, do not proceed. Sit. Wait for the count to correct itself. I sat down. On the trail, in the dark, in the fog, with 12 wrong-colored markers standing around me like the bars of a cage that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. I turned off my headlamp because I didn't want to see what else might have changed, and I sat in total darkness, and I waited. The footsteps started within minutes. Not from one direction, from several, circling, the measured, deliberate pace of something walking the perimeter of my position at a fixed distance, never closing, never receding. And with the footsteps, voices. My name, in rotations, different tones, different registers, some that sounded like Earl, some that sounded like the woman who'd screamed for rescue, some that sounded like no one I knew, and some that sounded like everyone. Danny, 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 come on. Danny, it's time. Danny, I can see you. Each voice from a different point on the circle, each one calm, patient, certain. I sat with my knees drawn up and my forehead on my arms, and I did not respond, and I did not stand, and I did not turn on the light. My chest was tight, and my hands were shaking, and every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to move, to do anything other than sit motionless in the center of a ring of things that knew my name. I don't know how long it lasted. An hour, maybe 2. The voices cycled and overlapped, and occasionally one would try a new phrase, "You're alone out here," or "Your partner's not coming," probing at Rule 4, testing whether the lie still held. I said nothing. Eventually, and I mean this word precisely, because the process had the grinding, inevitable quality of a mechanism completing its cycle, the footsteps slowed. The voices thinned. One by one, the sounds withdrew, each one stopping at a slightly greater distance, like tide marks receding down a beach. I turned on my headlamp. 9 markers, yellow blazes, the correct count, and the correct color, standing in the correct positions, as if they had never moved. I stood up. My legs barely held. I walked the remaining distance to Station 9, counting every marker aloud. My voice cracked and thin in the fog, and I did not stop counting until my hand was on the station door, and the lock was turning, and the wood was between me and the trail. Inside, I sat at the desk, and I wrote the log, and then I sat in the dark and listened to the silence and knew that the hollow was no longer testing. It was close. It was patient. It had tried every rule and found me obedient. And now it had one left, the one Earl said takes the good ones, the grieving ones, the ones who came here carrying something they couldn't put down. Rule 6, the voice of the dead. And somewhere in the fog, I knew it was practicing. Night 9. I almost didn't patrol. I stood at the station door with my hand on the latch and my pack on my shoulders, and I looked at the fog through the window, and I thought about what Earl had said, decide if you're staying or running, because this place doesn't give you long to choose. And I understood that running was still possible. The truck was fueled. The road was open. Whatever the hollow was, it did not follow people out of the valley. Every account in the logbooks suggested a territory, a boundary, a jurisdiction as clearly defined as any ranger district. I could leave. I could drive until I had cell service and call the district and say, I quit, and never say why. But I didn't leave, because some part of me, the part that had sat in a dispatch chair for 8 years, holding the line for voices I couldn't reach, understood that leaving was what this place counted on. High turnover, seasonal. The position would be posted again, and someone else would sit at this desk, and someone else would hear their name, and someone else would carry their private grief into the fog like a key into a lock. I went out. The fog was the thickest I'd seen, not the low, creeping kind, that threads through the hardwoods, but a solid wall. A white void that began at the station door and erased the world a foot at a time. My headlamp was useless past arm's length. I navigated by trail, feel, and marker count. Each step placed by memory, each breath measured because the fog was so dense it felt like breathing cloth. Mile 3, 2:08 a.m. The trail bent south along the ridgeline, and the fog opened for a moment, the way fog sometimes does. A brief window of clarity that let me see 30 yards of trail before the white closed again. In that window, I heard him. "Danny? Danny, can you hear me?" Marcus. Not an approximation. Not a simulation close enough to fool a stranger. Marcus's voice, at 16, with the particular thinness of a boy whose body is shutting down from cold. The words arriving in the exact cadence of that last phone call, the rising pitch on "hear me," the slight stutter on the first syllable of "Danny" that I'd attributed to hypothermia, and later, in the worst hours, to fear. My feet stopped moving. "Danny, I think someone's here. Don't hang up, okay? Please don't hang up." The last words he ever said to me, the words that had lived in my chest for 3 years, replaying every night, a loop I'd tried to silence with distance and darkness and a job at the end of a road where no phone could ring. And here they were, in the fog, in the voice of a dead boy, delivered with such fidelity that for one terrible, luminous moment, I believed he was alive, that the search had been wrong, that the mountains had held him, that he'd been walking these trails for 3 years, waiting for the one person who owed him an answer. Rule 6. If you hear a voice you know to be dead, do not weep, do not speak, do not stop. Grief is the door. I stopped walking. I was already breaking the rule. My eyes were burning, and my throat was closing. And the grief I'd carried across 3 years and 800 miles was rising through my chest, like groundwater through cracked stone. Grief is the door. I could feel it opening, not metaphorically, not emotionally, but physically. A sensation of expansion in the air around me, as if the fog were inhaling, as if the valley were making room for something to step through. "Danny, please. I'm so cold. I've been so cold." Words he never said. New words in his voice, perfectly rendered. The hollow had finished learning him. It had taken the fragments from the 911 recording my recording, the one that lived in the county's digital archive, the one I'd listened to 400 times in the months before I quit, and it had built a whole boy from the pieces. And now it was speaking him into the dark, like a lure cast into water it knew I was swimming in. I stood on the trail, and I pressed my hands over my mouth, and I did not speak, and I did not weep, and I did not move, but the door was open, and I could feel the hollow on the other side of it, waiting, patient, certain that grief would do what headlamps and rescue instincts and loneliness had failed to do. Section 2. Every rule at once. Then everything happened at once. From the left tree line, Danny. My name, soft and close, Rule 1. From the east slope, the woman's scream, the rescue cry, perfectly timed at 2:14. Rule 2. Live an immediate and indistinguishable from a real emergency. From behind me, Earl's voice. Danny, listen to me. You need to come off the trail. And this time, it said it 3 times, 1, 2, 3 each repetition, more perfect. The third so flawless that it carried the smell of thermos coffee and the sound of a truck engine idling. Rule 3, completed. From beside the trail, the calm, reasonable voice, "Are you by yourself out here, Ranger?" Rule 4. I looked down. The trail markers were glowing orange. 14 of them, where there should have been 9, stretching into the fog like runway lights leading somewhere that wasn't the station. Rule 5. And above it all, threading through every other sound like a melody through noise, Marcus's voice. "Danny, don't hang up. Please, I'm right here. I've always been right here." Rule 6. The door. The harvest. 6 rules. 6 simultaneous violations, each one a hook set in a different part of my mind, each one pulling me toward a different response. Turn the light. Run to help. Break radio silence. Confirm my solitude. Follow the markers. Answer the dead. I did none of them. I clamped my jaw until my teeth ached. I pressed my hands flat against my thighs. I did not turn my headlamp toward any voice. I did not step toward the screaming woman. I did not run from the completed repetition of Earl's voice. I opened my mouth and said, in a voice that cracked on every word, "My partners, right behind me." The lie, the necessary, engineered, life-preserving lie. I did not look at the markers. I closed my eyes and walked by memory, counting steps instead of posts, my boots finding the packed earth of the trail by texture alone. I walked the way you walk through a burning building, not toward safety, but through destruction, trusting that the other side exists, even though you cannot see it. Marcus called after me. The voice followed me step for step, and it wept. Not the weeping of a simulation, the weeping of a boy who had been alone in the cold for 3 years, waiting for someone to answer. And the someone was walking away, and the boy was saying, "Danny, Danny, please, you promised you wouldn't hang up. You promised." I did not stop. I did not speak. I did not weep, though my face was wet, and my chest was a fist, and every step was an act of violence against the person I used to be, the dispatcher who never left a caller alone, the man who had taken this job as penance for the one time he couldn't save someone, and was now saving himself by refusing to save that same voice again. The fog thinned. The markers I opened my eyes were yellow. 9 of them, correctly spaced, leading to the dark shape of Station 9, whose porch light burned a small orange circle in the pre-dawn gray. I walked through the gate. I locked it. I locked the door. I turned off every light and sat in the dark and listened to the silence reassemble itself around the station. And the silence was different now, not pressing, not breathing, but receding, pulling back, the way water pulls back before it returns. I'd obeyed every rule, all 6, simultaneously. The hollow had thrown everything it had, and I had walked through it. But I hadn't won. I knew that. You don't win against something patient. You survive the night, and the night comes again. And the rules hold until they don't. I sat at the desk as the light came up, and I looked at the rules, and I looked at the logbooks, and I looked at the posting notice I'd printed from the Federal Jobs Board, and I saw it. Not a revelation, an assembly, pieces that had been in front of me since the first drive in, clicking into place with the quiet inevitability of a lock engaging. The rules didn't protect hikers. There had never been a significant hiker disappearance in the Hollow Creek district. I'd checked early on, when I still thought the rules were about liability. The missing persons were all rangers, all night patrol, all single coverage, all overnight rotation. The rules existed to manage the rangers, to keep them alive long enough to complete a rotation, to maintain the position's viability as a posting that could be filled again and again. The district wasn't understaffed because of budget cuts. It was understaffed by design. Single ranger, no partner, no overlap, no one on site who would notice if you stopped writing mid-sentence at 2:14 a.m. The generous pay wasn't hazard compensation. It was bait. The recruiter's relief that I had no family wasn't professionalism. It was a checkbox. No family means no one asking questions when the seasonal hire doesn't come home. I thought about the recruiter's question. Do you have family in the region? I thought about Earl's words. It picked you for a reason. They always pick the ones with unfinished calls. I thought about Daniel Voss, a man with no family, no close friends, no one waiting, carrying 3 years of guilt over a dead boy whose voice he'd recognize anywhere. A man who took a job at the end of a road where no phone could ring, who walked into a valley that harvests the grieving, who sat at a desk where 11 people had vanished. I hadn't been recruited despite my wound. I'd been recruited for it. The hollow was not a hazard the district managed. The hollow was a process the district served. The rules kept the ranger alive long enough to be useful, a consistent human presence in the territory, a maintained trail system, a checked register. And when the rules finally broke, as they always did, the hollow collected what it had been promised, and the district posted the position again. I was not the ranger. I was the offering, and the rules were not my protection. They were my shelf life. I understood, sitting there with the morning light, flat and gray on the desk, what was coming. The architecture of it was in Rule 3, spelled out in the same blood-careful precision as every other rule. The hollow had spoken Marcus's voice to me twice. Once on the final night, in the fog. Once during the convergence, when all 6 rules fired at once. 2 repetitions. Rule 3. If a voice repeats a phrase exactly twice, it has not finished learning you. If it says it a 3rd time, it has. 2 times meant it was still practicing, still refining, still closing the gap between Marcus's voice and the version of Marcus it was building from my grief, my memory, my guilt. 2 times meant it wasn't ready. 3 times meant it was. And finished learning didn't just mean it could reproduce Marcus. It meant it could reproduce me. The rule's deeper logic, the logic I'd missed until the logbook spelled it out in 11 interrupted sentences, was reciprocal. The hollow learns your voice by learning the voice you respond to. It builds the lure and the replacement simultaneously. When the 3rd repetition comes, it has both the voice that can call you into the fog and the voice that can walk back out wearing your name. I sat at the desk and I looked at the clock. It was 2:13 a.m. I'd been sitting here since the night began, unable to make myself patrol, unable to make myself leave. The generator hummed. The radio sat silent on its mount. The logbook was open in front of me, my pen in my hand, my handwriting steady. Somewhere outside, the fog was thick, and the valley was dark, and the hollow was patient. I was waiting for the 3rd time. I'd been waiting all day without admitting it to myself, because the third time was coming whether I waited or not. And the only question left was whether I would hear it from inside the station or from the trail where it could reach me. I checked the locks. I closed the shutters. I sat with my back to the wall and the laminated page in my lap. The clock read 2:14. The radio clicked on by itself. The power switch hadn't moved, but the speaker came alive with a soft hiss. And in the hiss, underneath, barely there, but unmistakable to someone who'd spent 8 years listening for voices inside Static Marcus. Not words yet, just the shape of his breathing, the pattern I'd memorized from 42 minutes on a 911 line. In, out, in, the slight catch on the inhale that meant he was cold. Waiting, the way the hollow waits. I reached for the radio. I pulled my hand back. I reached again. The breathing continued, patient, familiar, like a boy on a phone line, waiting for someone to tell him help was coming. I didn't touch the dial. I sat there with my hand an inch from the radio, and my eyes on the clock, and my heart beating so loudly I could hear it in my wrists. And I waited for the third repetition to come or not come. And I thought about the 11 rangers whose handwriting stopped mid-sentence. And I thought about Perry, who wrote nothing at all. And I thought about Earl, who never went past the second mile. And I wondered which one I was going to be. If you're listening to this, you're probably sitting at the desk in Station 9. You probably found this in the footlocker with the other logbooks, or on the recorder I left in the top drawer, or in whatever form this confession takes by the time it reaches you. It doesn't matter how you found it. What matters is that you're here, and you're alone, and someone told you the pay was good. I'm still alive. I want to be clear about that. I'm still patrolling. I'm still obeying the rules. I'm still counting markers and logging voices and saying, my partner's right behind me, to things that stand beside the trail at 1 a.m. with the calm patience of someone holding a door open. But I need to tell you something about what happens when you follow the rules for long enough. They start to feel like home. The markers begin to look friendlier than the station. The fog starts to feel like company. The voices, and I know how this sounds, and I know it's the thing I'm supposed to fight. The voices start to sound less like threats and more like invitations, and the distinction between fear and longing gets so thin you can't find it in the dark. I catch myself wanting to answer Marcus. Not every night. Not yet. But some nights, when the fog is thick and the station is cold and the silence is the kind that leans against you, I think about what it would mean to say his name. Just once. Just to let him know I'm still here. That I didn't hang up. That I never hung up. That's how it works. That's what the rules are really holding back. Not the thing in the woods, but the part of you that wants to let it in. I'm writing a 7th rule. I'm writing it on a new laminated sheet, in the same official font, in the same blood-careful language, and I'm adding it to the page on the nail by the door. It says, Rule 7. If you begin to find comfort in the voices, request transfer immediately. The hollow does not take the afraid. It takes the willing. I don't know if it will save anyone. The other 6 didn't save everyone, and this one is written by a man who isn't sure he wants to be saved. But rules are what we leave behind when we can't leave behind anything else. And if this one gives the next ranger an extra week, an extra night, an extra hour of clarity before the fog feels like a blanket instead of a shroud, then it's worth the laminate. Follow the rules. All of them. Even when they feel cruel. Even when the voice in the dark sounds like the person you came here to escape. Especially then. It's 3:17 a.m., and I've been recording for 20 minutes, and the fog is against the windows, and the radio has been doing the breathing thing again. That slow, patient inhale-exhale that isn't static and isn't mechanical, and isn't anything except a boy on a phone line, waiting. I want to tell you one more thing. Last night, I patrolled the Ridgeline Trail, and at mile 3, I stopped because the fog opened, the way it sometimes does. And in the clearing, I saw the trail markers, all 9, yellow, correct, and standing beside the 9th marker was a shape that was almost a person. Not quite. The proportions were right, but the stillness was wrong. The kind of stillness that isn't the absence of motion, but the presence of something choosing not to move. And it was facing the station, not looking at me, looking past me, at Station 9, at the desk, at the chair where the next ranger would sit. It was wearing a park service jacket. The nameplate was too far away to read in the fog, but the shape of it was familiar, the way the shoulders set, the way the head tilted, the way the hands hung at the sides, with the fingers slightly curled. I know that posture. I see it every morning in the mirror. I think the hollow has spoken Marcus 3 times now. I think the 3rd happened while I wasn't listening, in the static between radio checks, in the silence between patrols, in the space between waking and sleeping, where attention slips and consent is given without words. I think it has finished learning me. I'm sitting at the desk, and the logbook is open, and my pen is in my hand, and my handwriting is steady. And I want you to know that I am still me. I am still Danny Voss. I am still the man who took this job because he couldn't save a boy on a phone line and thought silence would be penance. But a few minutes ago, I heard my own name from the tree line, and it was in my own voice. Not Marcus's voice. Mine. My voice, calling my name from the dark, with the same intimacy the hollow has always used, the soft certainty, the unquestioned familiarity, the way you'd call your own name if you were standing outside yourself and wanted to come home. Rule 1 says, don't turn the headlamp toward it. Rule 6 says grief is the door. But there's no rule for hearing yourself. There's no rule for the moment when the thing in the woods finishes its work and walks back to the station, wearing your name and your voice and your handwriting, and sits at the desk and picks up the pen and starts writing a log entry that you don't remember beginning. I'm writing this sentence, and I don't know if I'm the one writing it. If you hear me out there, if you hear Danny Voss on the trail, on the radio, in the fog, calling your name in a voice that sounds like it knows you don't.